Welcome everybody to another webcast. Hi, I'm Dr. Shayne Morris, and I really am excited to bring to you a subject that I think all of us are interested in, and it's something that, in fact, my grandfather had a really deep understanding of this subject, and the subject is parasites. It's something that I think, we've gotten away from a little bit, and part of that is because we've embraced this new word called the microbiome. And what the microbiome has done for us is it's taught us that not all microorganisms are dangerous. Not all microorganisms are out there to create and cause disease, take us down, etc. We now know that the microbiome, in many instances, it's made up of these microorganisms, including bacteria, virus, parasites, fungi. There's the good guys as well. And the good guys help us maintain the bad guys. However, I think it's still a very important point that we talk about parasites, because parasites don't always have your best interest in mind. I mean, as the term describes, they're parasites. They're living off you, and in some cases that relationship can be extremely damaging. So tonight I want to go over what some of the parasites are like, what they're made up of, what their physiology is, how they infect us to some degree. We'll go through that carefully, not in too much in depth, by the way. And then I want to bring in some of the herbs and nutrients we use to keep parasites at bay and or actually eliminate them. Because there's some wonderful historical data on how powerful herbs can be, and the components in the herbs can transform the parasites in our bodies, and they can help us get rid of them. And these are really ancient, in many cases, ancient medicines from the equatorial regions, especially where parasites are the most prevalent, whether they be African, South American, Asian, etc. We have some really wonderful scientific data that supports a lot of the ethnobotanical data that my grandfather was exposed to when he was traveling the globe. So parasites. I love the idea of parasites. They're a little intimidating because the first thing I want to talk about is how parasites are not simple organisms. In the past, when we talk about the microbiome and bacteria are quite simple. Viruses are the most simple, so we're going to shelf those for tonight. Bacteria are next. They contain DNA, they contain membranes, they contain some organelles, but otherwise they're really quite simple. Parasites look a lot like humans, and they're what are called eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells make up things like mammals and insects and reptiles and etc., including parasites. So what does that mean? When you think about a cell is an amazing mixture of compounds like DNA, RNA, organelles like mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatus and ribosomes and the cellular membranes, the nuclear membranes. You've all heard these terms, especially if you've listened to myself. I use these terms all the time when we're talking about the cell. So let's dissect a couple of parasites right now. A parasite can be either single cell, so there's single cell parasites like protozoa, and then there's multiple celled or a complex organism parasite like a trematode or a worm, a roundworm or a fluke or a flatworm, helminths otherwise. These two examples are made up of cells each. One is a single cell, the other one is a complex group of cells. And we'll get into this, but these cells, the individual cells, are extremely complex. They're just as complex as a human cell, meaning that they have a beautiful membrane that is embedded with proteins and receptors and transporting proteins to allow hormones in and out, to allow waste to leave, to allow nutrients to come into the cell. Inside the cell, they have a nucleus, so the DNA is kept in a nuclear envelope or a nuclear membrane. They're filled with mitochondria, the energy powerhouses. They have Golgi apparatuses. They have lysosomes and peroxisomes, and they have amazing scaffolding inside the cell that allows communication inside the cell, in between organelles. They produce proteins that are both used inside the cell to create energy, to create new enzymes, to allow them to digest their food, to allow them to sense where they are, what we call chemotaxis, or sensing where they're going. They can develop small actual organelles like eyes and other chemosensors like what we'd consider the beginnings of taste, etc. These are single-celled organisms. They can develop, oh, by the way, they can develop things like cilia and flagella, which allows them to move. These are like tails. A good example is the sperm, where you have that long tail that helps propel it. Single-celled parasites can do that in a number of ways. Cilia, flagella, it allows them to move. It allows them to enter into other tissues. It allows them to live in the environment. These single-celled organisms can live both within the human being, and they can live out in the world, planktonic. They can survive in other areas. They can survive in vectors. So they're extremely, extremely creative, and they have adapted to our world very well, which makes them, to some degree, quite dangerous. Then we have multiple-celled organisms like flukes, roundworms, flatworms, and all of these organisms are made up of trillions of cells, billions to trillions. So they become more of a complex organism. I think a good visual would be an earthworm. If you're looking at an earthworm, it is made up of billions of cells that together form the different organelles that you see in an earthworm. You can see this primitive digestive tract. You can see these sensors that allow it to move through the soil and figure out where it's going, whether that be sensors to smell or chemicals. Again, rudimentary eyes can be found on some of these parasites. And that differentiation, that complexity, again, starts to make them look more and more and more complex, like our own tissues. That being said, why does that matter? Why am I making a point of saying that they're complex, both in a single cell way and in a multiple cellular way? The reason I'm bringing that up is because that complexity makes them much more difficult to attack and or get rid of and to kill using natural products or even drugs for that matter. Because the things that act on a parasite can, in fact, act on your own tissues. So there's this fine line we have to walk. And we're going to talk in a minute about what kind of mechanisms inside the parasite that compounds in plants that we have discovered over the millennia actually work to help you destroy parasites. Sometimes it's destruction, sometimes it's elimination, and we'll go through that a little bit. But it's that complexity that really raises a very great challenge. Furthermore, that complexity allows these organisms to evade many of our own systems, whether it be they can penetrate tissues. So if you come in contact with a single-celled organism, protozoa, they can evade your system by burrowing in between tight junctions. So they can leave the digestive tract and enter the systemic. They can enter the blood, they can enter the plasma, they can circulate, they can enter other tissues like the liver, they can enter the brain in some cases. So they've become very, very adaptive to their environment. Single-celled organisms can be particularly dangerous too because once they enter these tissues, they can reproduce. So not only are they dangerous in the sense that they're getting deep inside you, inside your tissues, they can even enter into some larger cells, but they can reproduce. And that reproduction, so there's a number of ways in which they can cause damage. One is they can destroy the tissue that they're feeding off of, or whether they're producing toxins that destroy the tissues inside of you. Secondly, they can actually enter those tissues and destroy the tissue in what we'd otherwise think of as a protected organ. And they can evade the immune system in the process. The immune cells don't always know how to track them down. Why? Because they have developed very clever strategies to evade the immune system. So parasites can be extremely, extremely challenging. And that picture I'm painting is critical as we move into when we look at herbs as preventative or treatments. That's the single-celled organisms. Now, these larger, multiple cellular parasites don't tend to invade the tissues as easily. Some do. Roundworms, for example. They can, again, invade into the tissue. They can bust through the intestinal tract or the lungs, or if you get one in your eye, it can push its way through into the brain. Again, they're very clever, and this ability makes them extremely dangerous. They're dangerous in that sense, but now they're also dangerous because they look a lot like your own tissues in many cases. For example, if we take a compound, let's say we take an anti-parasitic drug that shuts down ATP production. So it's a very effective drug that is going to shut down ATP production. And it turns out there are a number of those that we have access to through the plant world. However, when you consume this drug to kill a parasite, you'll find, and many of you clinicians who have worked on parasites and continue to have a clientele that are exposed to parasites, you'll find that there's really serious side effects for anti-parasitic drugs, both natural and or pharmaceutical based. And one of the reasons, or the reason for that, and the reason I'm really bringing up these similarities is because when you target a system, so what makes ATP inside of a cell? It's the mitochondria. So we have mitochondria. In every tissue in our body, we have mitochondria. Some more than others, as you know. The brain and the heart are filled with them. The muscles can be filled with them. We have a lot of mitochondria in our cells. However, so do parasites. And parasites use the mitochondria the same way we do. They make ATP. So as they're making ATP, we're making ATP, and we are now consuming an herbal component that attacks ATP production. Well, the good news is many of these, there's subtle differences where with a parasite, one, you have exposure because it's in the bloodstream, they're mobile, there's certain tissues that they're residing in. You can load up a certain amount of these herbal components, these herbal chemicals, let's call them chemicals or phytoconstituents, that are going to target that ATP production. And when they do that, they go into they penetrate the cell and they start shutting down the ATP production. The cool thing about that is being a single cell organism or even a simple multiple cellular organism like a fluke, let's say, the ability to get that compound is much easier to get it into those cells than it is your own cells. It will get into our own cells. However, there are mechanisms in our cells that slow it down. We have a slight greater complexity that slows that down, which allows us through dosing and through other types of cycling of these herbs and combining of these herbs with other restrictions, let's say nutrient restrictions as well as herbal extract or herbal compound introductions, we can modulate and really try to target parasites. So we want to shut down ATP production in the parasite. What does that do to the parasite? That's a goner. When you shut down ATP production, those parasites will die. And there are many other ones we'll touch on too later. In the process, though, there are some cells in your body that you will shut down ATP production, and those are the side effects. You may have gastrointestinal discomfort because you've destroyed some of the cells in the lining of the epithelial tissues, right? Endothelial tissues. You may have not only a little irritation in the GI, you may have irritation in the skin. Again, any cells that are reproducing rapidly might suffer from this type of intervention. However, it is still our best tool. And what I'm telling you is this is important because as much as I love our relationships with bacteria and fungus and the other things in our world, when they're dangerous, and we have to take any means necessary to get rid of them. So what have we done in the plant world and the parasite world to help modulate and or protect ourselves? One of the things I want to go over with you, and I have some cheat sheets here for you, but for me, actually, not for you. There are a couple of ways we think about it, and I'll get into my grandfather's description of the classifications of parasites, slightly different, and we'll cover that in a minute. But the common vernacular now is we have two kinds. We have protozoa, and we have helminths. Protozoa are the single-celled organisms. They're one cell, and again, as I mentioned, they look a lot like they're eukaryotics. They have a lot of the same structures we do. And then the helminths are the worms, the flatworms, roundworms, flukes. These are multiple cellular. So we have protozoa and helminths. And we could break that down further for discussion. For example, if you want to say, what is malaria? Malaria is a single-celled organism, so that would classify itself under protozoa. What about a tapeworm? A tapeworm would be a helminth. That is a multiple cellular or a complex organism. What about a liver fluke? Well, that happens to be a multiple cellular, so again, a helminth. And you can start to see, just by using those two classifications, whether it be protozoa single cellular or helminths, which are very complex, you can really start to narrow down what you're worried about and what you might be studying or what your case might be involving when a patient comes to you. That's the first step of breakdown. And when you break these down even further, we can look at some of the interesting aspects. So for example, if we look at some of the protozoa, there's nomenclature. And if you're interested in this nomenclature, after my talk, I'll be delivering this information to CAST, and it will be made available to you when you call in and discuss what we've talked about tonight with CAST. I'll make all this available for you guys. But the fun thing about it, so let's go back to protozoa first. So if we look at protozoa, it can be broken down into even further categories. And one of them is called Sarcodina, and that is entamoebas. Entamoebas fall under Sarcodina. And those are amoeba-type parasites. We then have Mastigophora. Those are flagellated ones. So there's your Giardia and your Leishmania. Leishmaniasis is what comes from that. We then have Ciliophora. So those are ciliates. Flagella is one long tail, by the way. Cilia are lots of little hairs that you see these things moving. There's a number of videos online. You can Google, YouTube, and watch how some of these parasites move, these single-celled parasites in the protozoa category. And then we have Sporozoa, and these are non-motile organisms. These cannot move. They just move through the bloodstream or through waterways. They're passed along, but they don't move on their own. And these are Plasmodium and Cryptosporidiums. These are all not only fascinating and worthy of our study, these can be very dangerous. How are they dangerous? Well, most of you have probably experienced some level of education about parasites, but in brief, and I think I mentioned earlier tonight, that they can be dangerous in the sense that they can feast off of our tissue, one. They can bury themselves deep into our tissues and create waste products and or toxins that destroy our tissues. And then finally, when they are being very invasive and they're both feasting and creating these metabolites, those tissues can start to undergo what's called the inflammatory cascade. So you have the parasite attacking you, but then you also have your body undergoing an inflammatory cascade. And if the parasite's around long enough, as we all know, you enter into this chronic inflammatory situation. So now you're damaging your own tissue from the immune system. The parasite is damaging your tissue, and it's this perfect storm, which can be extremely dangerous. And I don't need to tell you, most of you, that we understand that concept, and that concept leads us to we have to deal with these parasites, and we have to be very, very, very diligent and on top of it because they are very, very aggressive organisms. Before we get back to dealing with them and getting into some of the herbal world, let's jump to helminths. Okay, helminths, and some people pronounce it different. I pronounce it helminths. These are the larger organisms, right? And they can be extremely large. I mean, tapeworms can be 30 feet long in someone's intestinal, small intestine. They can also be segmented. They can have, again, eyes or other small organelles that we see when we find these larger parasites called helminths. So let's classify some of those. So we have platyhelminths. These are flat worms, okay? We have another one called the thorny-headed worms, or these are, and I'm going to mess this up, sorry if I do, these are acanthocephalans. These are a category of thorny-headed roundworms. We then have another set of roundworms called nematodes. Nematodes are interesting because they can be extremely invasive. There's a number of diseases that we know exist in third world countries that are just devastating, and many of these are caused by roundworms. And then finally, when we look at the flukes, we think of flukes as trematoda. It's the trematoda family or group, so trematodes are the flukes. This classification, although not critical for your clinical work, it's important that, I believe it's important that you understand that these organisms are classified in this way. One, because later on when we talk about the intervention and things we can do, we use some of these classifications when we're talking about herbs and what herbs work on. Secondly, when you're studying, when your practice involves people that carry some of these parasites, we have to worry about, they're gonna require unique and aggressive interventions depending on what kind you're dealing with and how invasive they are. So it is critical that you at least understand some of these classifications carefully. That is really the breakdown of these parasites. So it's fascinating that we understand these, okay? Now, that being said, excuse me, I want to look at when we have a parasitic infection, how do we discover these things? Because again, I mentioned they're invasive. There's a number of tests available. There's stool tests, there's blood tests. I know there are equipment that some of you may have that you can use to test your patients for the presence of parasites. And I think it's important at this point in time that some parasites are really easy to discover. These larger helminths, you're going to see large fragments in the stool. You're going to see them. Some of the roundworms you're going to see because they will eventually penetrate the tissue, and some of them come out in the appendages, in the feet or the legs or the arms. You'll see them. The protozoa, the single celled, are much harder to detect, but you can detect them using some of these tools like blood tests and other stool tests, etc. You're not always going to find them, but you can find them, especially if you're persistent. One of the challenges, of course, is where these parasites are in their life cycle. The protozoa can reproduce very easily inside our bodies and in our tissues, so oftentimes they're creating a lot of metabolic waste as well as babies, as well as small other cells that are being sloughed away in these various tissues, the blood, serum, the urine, and the feces. So there's a chance if they're there and they're long enough, you can catch them in those areas. The large helminths, sometimes they're more difficult, especially the worms, the roundworms that get into tissue, or the flukes. Oftentimes you have to find them through a series of challenges. So you might challenge the body with, you suspect something's going on, so you challenge the body with this an herbal concoction, and we'll get into that in a minute, to force them into, they don't reproduce in us, but they can slough off and parts of them leave your body to go and reproduce in their environment. And that's when you can catch them. I won't get into that a lot today. That's a fascinating avenue on its own, but sometimes you have to stress the body to get them to move, stress the parasite oftentimes to get them to move. And perhaps, intriguingly, when you do stress the body, you are simultaneously stressing the parasite. Now, we don't want to push too hard, but you can stress a parasite, and it will move to find a more hospitable environment. Keep that in mind. They don't want to be in an unhospitable environment because they're at risk like you are. They want to live off you, but they also don't want to destroy you necessarily, because then they have to leave you and find another host. So it's this balance, this natural balance. How do we then look at that and say, okay, what are our possible interventions? And I'm going to mention a few really quick before I get into some really exciting work with herbs and nutrients. But first off, parasites are going to live off the same things you live off of, and they're going to take advantage of the same types of nutrients you take advantage of. So first and foremost, parasites love simple sugars. So it's a recommendation by most people that work with these in the clinic, cut simple sugars, cut simple everything, simple carbs, simple sugars, processed foods, because they're readily and easily metabolizable, which makes them extremely accessible to parasites. The more complex, the more difficult the parasite has to work to get to those things, right, as it's stripping nutrients from you. There's a balance between nutrients like minerals and vitamins and other micronutrients where you need them to fight the fight, but they also need them to survive. And that's a balance that you almost have to test the waters with each and every person individually. I won't spend much more time on that because it's very complex. Finally, we get to herbal extract and other interesting phytochemical, not pharmaceutical, that's terrible, phytochemical interventions. And phytochemical interventions are not to be laughed at. In fact, I believe it was 2017, one of my favorite antiparasitic plants, sweet wormwood, was essentially awarded the Nobel Prize for its ability to eradicate malaria in parts of the world. So how awesome is that? There's a compound in it called artemisinin, and that artemisinin compound, and I think you heard me say it earlier, it has the ability to directly affect the endoplasmic reticulum, or a specialized version, the sarcoendoplasmic reticulum in malaria, which forces that organism to die, to undergo catastrophic destruction. That is amazing, because when you think about this, that is a plant that we've had access to. That is a plant that people in the equatorial region have always used for this purpose. They've used it to help treat their own parasites in their own communities in both Africa, South America, etc. So it's amazing, and it's also a Chinese. I mean, it's a Chinese plant. So in China, in other areas of Asia, you can use sweet wormwood in that capacity. So it's amazing. I love when we take these ethnobotanical, rich ethnobotanical stories, and we apply a little bit of science, and that marries both these long-standing stories to help with our health, and especially in the case of parasites, to help us in that endeavor. And then science brings in the mechanism by which it works. And so it's essentially a validation of what we already believed. And that's really exciting. And that's happening more and more, by the way, in this field, which is why I'm bringing this to you today, because I'm excited that I'm seeing work being done in Asia by researchers, India, Asia, and even South America and Africa, where they're taking these plants that they've always known and always used in their world, in their medicinal world, and they're showing how they work against these various parasitic organisms, these pathogenic parasitic organisms. And I can say that, right? These are things that are being studied. These aren't things that aren't as anecdotal as they used to be. So now we can start using terminology like scientific studies, which is really exciting for me, and I'm hoping that you guys find it exciting as well. And I want to talk about a few of these plants and how they might work. So for example, let's take Cestoda or Nematoda. So we're looking at large multicellular organisms. And there's something that you're all very aware of, garlic. Garlic has compounds within it that can be extracted and concentrated that are extremely effective against nematodes and cestoda, which are tapeworms and roundworms. This has been shown in a number of different studies, typically in vitro or animal. That's pretty amazing, I thought. If we look at and trematodes too, so the flukes as well. Garlic actually is quite amazing. We look at valerian root. We think of valerian as an herb that we use for calming and relaxation, because it clearly has some compounds that apply to the valeric acid, and they're very calming in nature. However, some of these compounds, as well as others found in valerian, have an anti-parasitic quality, which is, again, exciting. This is really fun, exciting new stuff. And these are both, there's been some work done in both the larger nematode as well as in protozoa. So this one crosses both boundaries from the multicellular organism to the single-celled organism. Well, how's that possible? Well, if we reflect back onto my original statements, at the cellular level, these things are extremely similar, right? We have mitochondria and nucleus and membranes just like they do, and they have those same things to each other, whether they be multicellular or single cellular. So the mechanisms in these plants can be taken advantage of across these gradient of organisms, of these parasites. So that again makes our life a little bit easier when you're looking at this from a clinical standpoint, going, wow, I need tools, and these tools I know that this tool can work in a number of formats. That makes your life a little easier. Formats being with different organisms, right? Whether it be a complex or single cell. It does make our life a little bit easier, and it helps us elucidate how these things work. And we know that if they work against, for example, the nucleus, let's pick on another one, wormseed oil. Wormseed oil has a number of lactones and a number of essential oils, triterpenes and terpenoids, that we know work against disrupting membranes. Membranes meaning the outer membrane of, let's say, a single cellular or multicellular, as well as inner organelle membranes like the endoplasmic reticulum, or the nucleus. And when it disrupts membranes, when your membranes become disrupted, you no longer can communicate. You can't transfer waste in and out of the cell. You can no longer understand what's going on around you through chemical sensing or hormonal sensing. When that starts to happen, these organisms are doomed. So the really amazing piece here is that you now have another tool in the worm seed where it can start to shut down these membranes, and these membranes will lead to the death of that organism. There's collateral, there's subtle collateral damage to our own tissues, but we have the ability to manage that. And we'll get into that later. That's through dosing and through, we understand that our tissue has some resiliency, a little higher resiliency. We'll get back to that. That's worm seed, and worm seed studies have shown, and I've recorded some of them here, that we got nematode from the helminth group, right? So we have the larger ones, as well as leishmaniasis and plasmodium, which is a protozoan. So again, single cellular and multicellular. This is a theme that's building, and I'm hoping that, although I'm repeating myself to a degree, I want you guys to really follow this theme, because it's going to empower you, for those of you that are working on and do have these types of cases in your clinic. And I can promise you, they're not going to go away. As much as I love the microbiome, as much as I love the positive relationships we have with microorganisms, these kinds of pathogens are not going to go away. And I should say that when you do have a pathogenic experience, when you become infected, whether it be with a parasite or a fungal or a microbiological or a bacteriological, they can wreak havoc on your microbiome, right? That's been shown a number of times, and I've probably told you that. The microbiome suffers from pathogens when they are allowed to take over. So that's important for me to point out. Not something that we're going to spend time on today, but maybe later when we get into the microbiome again, some later talks, I really want to show you how that's important, that pathogens are very disruptive for long term as well. Pathogens can set your microbiome into a dysbiosis for 6 months, a year. So it's critical that we deal with these things quickly. And the exciting thing about this is I mentioned that these herbs, whether it be the valerian I just mentioned, or the worm seed, or the sweet wormwood, some other ones I have, Kamala, Cassia, Amara, and I'm going to keep going briefly. The cool thing about this, you guys, is your microbiome has some resiliency as well. It's not understood how. I couldn't even begin, except for theoretically, to tell you my thoughts on that. But our microbiome can recover even as you're working with these herbs to affect the endpoint for a pathogen. So it's very exciting. I know I keep saying that, but it really is, you guys. This is an amazing, amazing new frontier that we want to embark on. And we're using very old tools. That's the other really exciting part. We don't have to invent anything new. Nature has provided. Let's look at some other ones. So we have, Cestota. I've talked about some of those. Mirabilis, Gelopula. That's good against some of the Cestota. Now let's jump to the Nematoda. Nematoda are against roundworms. We have black walnut. That's amazing. That has some clinical work on it, mostly in vitro. We have, again, worm seed. Worm seed crosses the boundaries. It shows up in a number of areas. I mentioned Quassia. That one not only has some efficacy with nematodes, but it has a positive benefit on the digestive tract simultaneously. So that's pretty exciting. Malaria. So Cassia amaria is also for protozoa, one being malaria. It has some efficacy there in vitro studies. And then finally, we've got betel nut. Everybody's heard of betel nut, or Emeria tenellata. That's one of the flukes that betel nut has shown some efficacies towards. And again, I've pulled up recent research on these things, which is why I'm presenting it to you today, because I was really excited to bring recent research to what I know was my grandfather's, one of his passions with some of these ingredients, right? His passion was in this field. Now we have some research to back up that passion. So now I'm passionate about it too, and I hope you're passionate as well. Jumping into protozoa, we've mentioned a few, but let's talk about some more. Again, worm seed, valerian, again, both good for protozoa. Kamala. Kamala's shown some protozoa activity for plasmodium. Mirabilis, I talked that. Wild geranium, that's pretty exciting. Star of anise. Star of anise had two things. Star of anise was interesting because it, not a parasite per se, but star of anise, and we use star of anise, by the way, it was an insecticide. So there are some parasites that invade our body or live on us that are actually very, very small insects. So there's an insecticide component there, as well as it seemed to benefit the digestive tract as well. Again, we don't know how, but there were some positive endpoints for digestive behavior with star of anise. Very, very amazing. Erva testau, that jumps also into trematoda, which are flukes. And flukes, again, black walnut, valerian, and you can see a pattern. There's so many of these ingredients that can be used across these different organisms. Betel nut, there is a Erva testau, guarana shows up there, and fleabane shows up in the fluke category, or the otherwise known as the trematoda. Those, although I've gone over this quickly, you'll have a chance. In fact, I challenge you after my talk to find out, if you've taken notes or if you have to watch this again, these ingredients I've told you about, I challenge you to go find out where they exist in something that you can use. And I'm going to talk about that right now. We meaning my grandfather first, and then we've made some subtle changes to what we call a formula. And we have formulas here at Systemic Formulas that we call VRM formulas, and they're right here. So as I wrap this up, you guys, and I know it's a lot in a little, but the reason we do this is so you can watch it and rewatch it. We have VRMs. It begins with VRM 1, moves to VRM 2, VRM 3, and 4. Now, that doesn't mean they're in cyclical or chronological order. In fact, grandfather Doc Wilwright, he actually had a plan. So VRM 1 and 2, and here's where the categories come into play. And this is where listening to this webcast is going to be so beneficial. VRM 1 and 2 are Cestoda VRM 1, Nematoda VRM 2. Cestoda, Nematoda. Flatworms and other roundworms. That's how we use these. And there's a cycling. And again, you can ask for details from CAST after this webcast to give you more detail on how to use these, but we cycle these. We have VRM 1 for the flatworms and Cestoda. These are 10 days on, 5 days off. Now, the cycling, which you probably can almost deduce, it's a deductive reasoning. We want to get these large organisms because they go through phases where they're either feeding, growing, and sometimes sloughing off young. We have to catch them and stress them during cycles so they don't adapt to a constant barrage of herbs. And some of the herbs I've read to you are found in each of these. So in VRM 1 and 2, there are the herbs that we've talked about, whether it be black walnut, worm seed, sweet wormwood. There's a grouping of herbs that you'll find in each one of these formulas. However, the brilliance of this is there are unique herbs in each one of these that is specifically designed for the category that we want to use it in, whether it be Cestoda, Nematoda. The next one is Protozoa. VRM 3 is Protozoa. Protozoa, remember, if you recall, it's quite an aggressive, dangerous category, and it is the single-celled organisms. Protozoa, VRM 3. Then finally, with VRM 4, we have Trematoda, or flukes. So the cool thing about this is we have categorically separated, we have combined the herbs, or grandfather combined the herbs to cover our bases. Furthermore, there's unique herbs in each one of these formulas that is meant to target that particular category, whether it be the roundworms, the flatworms, the protozoa, or the flukes. That's the brilliance. That's where we can take advantage of these formulas. And I want to add, there are a number of other companion formulas like WO, so keep that in mind. You'll have to circle back to that. I won't have time tonight to go through that. But I want to point out that these two, because of the cycling, they're large multicellular organisms. We have to cycle them. These two we do not. The smaller ones are constantly in a replication. They're constantly growing and replicating. we want to keep a constant pressure on them with VRM3 and 4. One of the questions I often get is, can we mix and match? Absolutely. Absolutely mix and match. Why? Because as you run the different tests, whether it be muscle testing, whether it be blood, feces, etc., you don't always know what's going on. And perhaps more often than not, you can have multiple, there are times when you have multiple organisms that are masking each other. We know that oftentimes when you get a parasite, you bring with it bacterial issues. There's these co-infectious type things, and we want to really take care of those with these herbal support formulas. We're supporting VRM1, 2, 3, and 4 with a very powerful set of herbs. And although I have to be careful how, well, I can talk about herbs and their efficacies, but these products, I've got to be careful for regulatory reasons that we are now doing a support of what I call the parasite biome or the parasitome. We want to balance that, meaning we want to have healthy interactions, not dangerous ones, by utilizing these amazing herbs that we find in these formulas. And we can mix and match. We can do the cycling, we can do the not cycling, but certainly as you look at these formulas, when you do get these formulas, please look at the labels. You'll notice there's a lot of overlap, and that's by design. And then you'll notice the unique features of each formula. What else do these formulas bring? Well, these can be combined with a number of other balancing formulas like 3-Bactrex, Fungi-X, WO. Keep that in mind that you don't have to be exclusive with these. These can be combined with other very powerful herbal tools. And I didn't get a chance to really delve into some of the mechanisms, but I can promise you that these, when you look, or if any of you are really, really, really inclined to become nerdy like myself, you can look at some of the publications on these herbs and these mechanisms of how some of these herbs, they attack the mitochondria to shut down. They might attack the membrane, as the example I gave earlier. They might attack calcium channels. They might attack endoplasmic reticulum, etc. So there's these amazing little molecules that nature has provided, and we have incorporated here into these world. And we do absolutely use the compound that we found in, or that received the Nobel Prize, the sweet wormwood. And believe it or not, where would we want to put the most of that? This is a quiz. It's going to show up in one of our formulas. And because it was studied for malaria, the VRM3 protozoa would be the formula that most of that sweet wormwood is found, because of the nature of what it does on protozoa. So we are very, very, very directed and focused on how we want to apply the herbs and apply these in practice. Now, I hope I was able to cover enough for you. It was a lot, I realize, but I can bring you more later, and please do your research. When you call CAST, I can have some of these documents available for you. Thank you for joining me. It was a pleasure. I love talking about these things, and I will see you next time.